Hey everyone, this is Matt Perez, and today I want to kick off a new series dealing with SolidWorks API. Now, this series isn't going to cover from the ground up. If you have no experience with SolidWorks API or VBA of any sort, then you're going to want to go to all the videos that Keith Rice did for the My MLC Services site. He has hours of content on there, and it's meant for ground level work, starting from ground zero with no knowledge of SolidWorks API or VBA. So if you don't have any, that's where you want to start. If you have a little bit, you don't necessarily need to be an expert or a pro at this. If you have a little bit of understanding of how things work, how you make your declarations, how the workflow goes, then you'll be able to follow along here. The idea is that we make a custom macro that will allow us to track custom properties, the file path of our part, when the user logs in and logs out, and ultimately save it all out to Excel. So we want to keep a record of all the time spent, any notes that were entered along the way as the user worked with this file, and kind of keep a record so we know overall how much time was spent. Now, this is important information, whether it's for your own personal use, if you want to keep an accurate record of how long you were working on a file, or if it's a company thing, if you need to have a more accurate, detailed record of the amount of time you spent on a certain file, whether it's designing a concept or working on a drawing, a detailed drawing to make a manual, or whatever the case might be. There are a lot of times where users want this information. They want more detailed records rather than, oh, I spent about an hour on that, about 2 hours on that, I worked on it for a day. Now you'll be able to really get a detailed idea of, well, I spent 23 minutes designing that bolt where I could have just purchased this or done that, and really get some sort of concrete data, some concrete information about how long things actually take. Because it's very easy to get roped into a model and you just kind of lose track of time and you say, well, how long did I actually work on that file? And it's really, there's no way to get that information. So the idea here is we're going to make this time tracker that is incorporated into the program. But the overall scope of what we're doing is to really determine a goal, determine a project that we want to do, and figure out how to work back through it and see how we can make that happen, the workflow that's needed in order to do that. So the first thing, I'm going to show you one that I've already built. So from a custom feature that I added on my macro toolbar, we see that we have a project number, a project name, a file path, an area here for notes, and we have login and log out. Now, of course, there's also a clear note section. We have a hide form section, and then you can see that since we have logged in, it tells us that we've logged in. This is very important too, because sometimes you can forget, well, did I actually log into the file? Is it tracking my time? Whatever the case might be. And then we log out. Now, all this information gets saved and put in an Excel spreadsheet, and we'll talk about how to access that as well. It won't be in super detail for that side of things. I'll basically show you the code, how we open and close it and work with it. And that's something that Keith Rice actually helped me out with in order to get it to be stable and work with multiple versions, 32 and 64-bit and so on. So we'll really just look at that code and not talk about how to create that code, because there's a lot of Win32 codes and information in there that's accessing DLL files and so on. So a bit outside of what we're doing here, but that information, you'll still be able to see it and get information there. So now that we have seen a program in action that's similar to what we want to do, how do we get started? Well, the first thing we need to do is create a new macro. So I'm going to start a new macro, and I'm just going to overwrite one that's already here. It's basically empty. There's nothing in that file. And I'm going to call it MLC Project Tracker. And you see that when we bring it in, there is no information right now. It's basically made some declarations for you, but we need to start from scratch. The first thing that we need to do, or that I like to do, is type option explicit at the top. Now this will prevent VBA from making assumptions. If we forget to declare variables at some point in time, it won't give it basically the leverage to allow it to auto declare it as whatever, as long, as string, as variant. It'll basically make sure that this program only works as if we declared everything as we see fit. We also want to change the SW app declaration from object to SLDworks.SLDworks. And the reason we want to do that is because this gives us access to a little bit more. If you just leave it as object, you don't get access to that iSLDworks interface. You do, but you don't. When you're typing things in and you hit the period, you don't get that pop-up menu with all the commands and things that you're getting from that interface. The next thing that we need to do is declare SW model. This is all standard information. Again, if you have any experience with SolidWorks API, then you have seen this many times before. If not, then this might look like Greek to you. So we want to declare SW model as SLDWorks.ModelDoc2. Now this ModelDoc2 interface is the next one down from the SLDWorks interface. This basically gives you access to a lot of information and also access to other interfaces. The next thing that we need to do is we need to access interface, whether it's one or multiple, that gives us the leverage, it gives us the functionality to get custom properties out of our file. So in order to do this, we're going to have to go back into SolidWorks and we're going to have to go into the API help file. So we want to make sure that we're not using the web help. We want to make sure that this is not checked. We'll go into our API help topics and we're going to just search for custom properties. Now, as I start to type this in, a few things come up. We note that iMirror part feature data. This doesn't really seem like something that we want, so we can just forget about that. Custom property manager for iFeature. Again, that doesn't really seem like what we want. But there are two things in this list that are promising. We have iConfiguration and iModelDoc extension. Now, we could go down either path here, but I'm going to use iConfiguration, and the reason being is I want to show you guys how to not only get access to custom properties, but also to access configuration specific custom properties, because there's two slightly different ways to go about that. So I want to just make the declaration that I'm going to use the iConfiguration interface. As we come in here, we see that we have some information. Gets the custom property information for this configuration. If I go into iModelDoc extension, it says gets the custom properties for this document or configuration. So it has a little bit more functionality into it, but we don't necessarily want to make it more complicated than it needs to be. So we're going to stick with iConfiguration, and you'll notice that in the usage section, they declare instance as iConfiguration and their value as custom property manager. So it looks like we're going to use this custom property manager to return a value. We want to go down into our example and click on this VBA example. Now we see that there's a lot of information. There's a lot of declared variables up here. And if we look at the very top, it tells us that it shows how to get the names, types, values, and resolved values of the active configurations, custom properties. Now remember, when we're dealing with a part or an assembly or a drawing, whatever the case might be, those custom properties are for the overall file. It doesn't change with the configuration unless you have configuration specific properties. But this looks like it's going to handle exactly what we need. Active configuration, which in our case, we're dealing with a file that has a default configuration. It also shows how to add a custom property to the configuration. This is going to be very handy because while we're getting custom property information, we also need to know how to add it if it's not in the file. So a lot of great information in this single example here. Now we want to make a note that they're accessing SLDWorks.configuration and they're also accessing SLDWorks.customPropertyManager. So these are two things that we're going to have to declare within our program as well to get access to those. Now, as we look down through the example, we can take a look at all of the bold text and get an idea of what they're doing. We can see that they have SWApp as application.SLDWorks. We have SW model as SWApp.activeDocument, which is very important. We're using whatever the open active document is. If you have multiple windows open, it's whichever one is currently active that you're working on. And then we have this config equals SW model.getActiveConfiguration. Well, we don't really need to know the active configuration per se. What we need to know is the custom property. So you see that the custom property is config.customPropertyManager. So it looks like we have a lot of things here, a lot of information here, and we need to sift through it and figure out exactly what we do need. Before we get too far into this example, let's just go ahead and hop into the iModelDoc extension and let's take a look at its example, because we see down here we have get custom properties of referenced part in VBA. So this program instantly looks a whole lot shorter. Now we'll notice that they have the extra declaration of ModelDoc extension, but we know from past experience that we can use SW model, which is part of ModelDoc2, and we can use SW model.extension. Whatever we need in order to get access to that information. So as we look down here, they declare the active doc, they declare model doc extension. This is all standard stuff that we need to have anyways. Then we have gets custom property data. SW custom property is set equal to model doc extension dot custom property manager. Well, that's pretty straightforward. It doesn't look like there's really too much to do here in order to get that custom property. Then they have this SW custom property dot get for dot. Then they have property name. So we can enter, in this case, we want project name and project number. We can just use that information and then figure out what the rest of this is doing. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at get for. Now, as you're probably starting to see, if you haven't done this before, it can turn into a pretty big rabbit hole. I mean, you start looking for things, you find that we need access to model doc extension, then we need custom property manager, and then they're using this get for, then we really need to figure out what get for is doing, or we also see that there's a get 5 here. So if we select get for, it's obsolete, it's superseded by get 5. And this one says gets the value and the evaluated value of the specified custom property. So as we go down, we see that they have a lot more declarations here. We have instance.get5. In our case, it's swmodel.extension.custom property manager, to get the custom property. And then we have all this information here where we can use a field name. If we look down the parameters, name of custom property, then we have all this other information that we need to handle. So there's a lot of things that we have on our plate already. We haven't created anything in our program, but we want to figure out how we can get that custom property information. So the best thing to do is to move forward with one of these options. Because the get5 method part of iCustom Property Manager, not using iConfiguration, looks like it's a little bit easier and straight to the point, we're going to go ahead and use this method and just see how we can access that data. Since we're already about 13 minutes into this video, I think it's a good place to stop now that we've covered a little bit of what we want to do in the project and how to navigate through the SolidWorks API help. The next video will pick up by accessing this custom property information and making sure that we're getting the correct data and that we're able to save it and set it inside of the memory so that we can use it in our user form and we can eventually take it out to Excel. But as always, if you guys have any questions, please email solidworksupport@mlc-cad.com and we'll see you next time.